There is a strange moment that comes before silence truly settles. It is not the instant when sound disappears, but the point when you realize nothing new is going to happen for a very long time. On a deserted island, that moment arrives quietly. The waves keep moving, the wind keeps brushing past leaves, birds come and go, yet none of these sounds carry intention toward you. Nothing is calling your name. Nothing is waiting for a response. Living alone on an uninhabited island for years would not begin with heroism or fear. It would begin with routine. The first days would be full of movement, decisions, small urgencies, where to sleep, where to find water, how to avoid sunburn. The mind would be busy, almost relieved to have clear problems instead of abstract worries. Modern life trains people to respond to notifications, deadlines, and expectations. An island strips all of that away and replaces it with questions that are older than language. After the initial shock fades, the island would start to feel less like a place and more like a system. The tide becomes a clock, shadows become calendars, hunger becomes the most honest signal you have ever experienced. You would learn quickly that food tastes different when it is earned slowly. A fish caught after hours of waiting carries weight that no restaurant meal ever could, not because it is better seasoned, but because it is connected to time, effort, and patience. Days would stretch in unfamiliar ways. Without schedules, time loses its sharp edges. Morning does not begin at a specific hour, but when the light changes enough to warm your skin. Night does not arrive suddenly. It slowly claims the sky in layers. At first, you might count days out of habit. Later, you might forget why counting ever mattered. Weeks blend together, and memory starts organizing itself around events rather than dates. The day the storm came, the day the coconuts fell, the night the moon was so bright it felt like another sun. Solitude, however, is not the same as peace. Being alone removes mirrors. There is no one to reflect your thoughts back to you, no casual conversation to soften sharp ideas. Thoughts echo longer, small regrets grow louder, old conversations replay themselves without interruption. On an island, you cannot distract yourself endlessly. There is no endless scroll, no background noise designed to numb. The mind becomes both companion and opponent. At some point, you would begin talking out loud, not because you expect an answer, but because silence can feel too heavy when carried alone. Words anchor thought. They give shape to drifting ideas. You might speak to the sea, to the trees, to the fire you carefully keep alive. These conversations would not be signs of madness, but adaptations. Humans are social not only because we like company, but because language stabilizes our sense of self. Physical survival would slowly become less dramatic and more methodical. You would learn where fresh water gathers after rain. You would notice which plants return reliably and which disappear without warning. Tools would become extensions of your body: a sharpened stone, a piece of driftwood, a woven fiber rope. Each one would carry hours of trial and error. Mistakes would be costly, but educational. There is no customer support on an island, only consequence. Weather would no longer be small talk. A cloudy morning would affect mood. A long dry period would bring anxiety. Storms would feel personal, not because they target you, but because they reshape your world without asking permission. After a strong storm, the island would look slightly different, and so would you. Each event leaves a mark, even if it does not leave a scar. Over months and years, memory would reorganize itself again. You might stop remembering faces clearly. Names would soften at the edges. Voices from your past might lose their exact tone. In their place, you would remember textures more vividly: the feel of wet sand at dawn, the weight of humid air before rain, the sound of waves at night when the wind stops completely. Your inner world would become quieter, but also deeper. Loneliness would not be constant, it would arrive in waves, much like the tide. Some days, solitude would feel expansive and calm. On other days, it would feel tight and confining. The absence of witnesses changes how actions feel. Achievements have no applause. Failures have no shared laughter. You would need to redefine success entirely. Simply staying alive another day would sometimes feel sufficient. Sleep would change too. Without artificial light, your body would slowly align with darkness. Nights would be longer, dreams more vivid. The stars would become familiar companions. You might begin recognizing patterns, noticing how certain stars rise together. Looking up would feel less like observation and more like participation in something vast and indifferent. Years alone on an island would not turn you into a wild animal, nor would it turn you into a philosopher automatically. It would make you slower, more deliberate, less interested in unnecessary movement. Energy would be precious, not because it is scarce, but because effort finally has visible cost. Every action has weight when nothing replaces it instantly. Eventually, you might stop wondering whether you could live this way and start wondering whether you would want to leave if given the chance. Civilization, once imagined as comfort, might feel overwhelming in memory. Noise, crowds, constant decision-making, all of it could feel strangely artificial after so much elemental living. The first thing that would disappear would not be comfort, but expectation. On a deserted island, there is no promise that anything will improve tomorrow. No schedule waits patiently for you, no voice calls you back from your thoughts. The world continues, but it no longer revolves around human urgency. It moves at a pace shaped by wind, water, and heat, and you are simply another living thing placed somewhere inside that rhythm. In the early days, survival would feel like a collection of urgent tasks stacked one after another. You would notice thirst before you noticed fear. The body always speaks first. The search for drinkable water would become the most immediate priority, turning your attention toward the landscape in a way modern life rarely demands. Every shadow, every depression in the ground, every cluster of leaves would be examined not with curiosity but with necessity. Rain would become less of an inconvenience and more of an event worth anticipating. Food would follow closely behind. Hunger, unlike boredom, carries a sharp edge that cannot be ignored for long. The idea of meals would shift away from taste and toward reliability. A small, consistent source of calories would matter more than variety. You would learn quickly that waiting is an essential part of obtaining anything from nature. Waiting near a tide pool, waiting for fruit to fall, waiting for the right moment to try again after failure. Time would stretch differently because every effort would have a visible consequence. The first shelter would almost certainly be imperfect, something leaning more than standing, something that protects from sun better than from rain. Yet even a flawed structure would bring a strange sense of ownership. For the first time, a place would feel connected directly to your own effort rather than purchased, rented, or assigned. The act of shaping branches, stacking materials, and testing stability would transform the island from an unknown environment into a space that responds, even slightly, to your presence. As days passed, your senses would sharpen, not because you intended them to, but because they would have to. Subtle changes in wind direction would begin to matter. The sound of distant surf might signal shifting tides. The difference between two similar plants would no longer be a minor detail, but a decision with consequences. Modern environments often drown out these distinctions with noise and convenience. On the island, the environment would present information constantly, and your survival would depend on noticing. The absence of human-made sound would be more noticeable at night. Darkness without electric light is not simply darker, it is deeper. Shapes dissolve into suggestion rather than outline. Your hearing would take on new responsibility, picking apart the layers of sound that remain: insects, distant water movement, the occasional crack of something shifting unseen. At first, this would create tension. Over time, familiarity would replace unease. You would begin recognizing which sounds belong and which feel out of place. Loneliness would not arrive as a dramatic wave. Instead, it would seep in quietly during moments when there is nothing immediate to solve. After water is secured, after food is gathered, after the shelter is repaired, the mind would look for the next point of engagement and find none waiting. Without conversation, thought becomes both tool and companion. You might replay memories with unexpected clarity, noticing details that once seemed trivial. Talking aloud would likely begin without ceremony, a comment made while adjusting something, a brief remark to no one in particular. Language helps structure awareness even when there is no listener. Over time, speaking might become part of routine, greeting the morning, noting the weather, reacting verbally to success or frustration. These words would not be wasted, they would stabilize a sense of continuity that silence sometimes dissolves. Physical labor would become steady rather than exhausting. The body adapts when movement is consistent and purposeful. Carrying wood, walking uneven terrain, climbing, lifting, all repeated day after day, would create strength that feels practical rather than aesthetic. There would be no mirrors measuring appearance, only results measured by whether tasks become easier. Storms would change your understanding of vulnerability. Even a well-constructed shelter would feel temporary under strong wind and heavy rain. The sound alone would dominate thought, making it impossible to ignore the scale difference between human effort and natural force. After each storm, the act of rebuilding or repairing would reinforce patience. Nothing on the island would remain perfectly stable for long. Over weeks, the concept of weekend would dissolve completely. There would be only cycles of light and dark, hunger and rest, effort and recovery. Counting days might continue out of habit, perhaps marked by scratches on a surface or small arranged stones. Eventually, the purpose of counting might fade. Memory would reorganize itself around events rather than numbers. The mind, lacking new external input, would begin generating its own variety. Old songs might return uninvited. Fragments of conversations from years ago might replay with unusual persistence. You might imagine how others would react to your situation, constructing silent dialogues. These imagined exchanges would not necessarily feel unreal. They would serve as mental rehearsal for connection that currently does not exist. At times, solitude would feel expansive. With no interruption, attention could rest fully on simple processes: the movement of water along the shoreline, the slow change of color in the sky, the rhythm of breathing after exertion. Without constant decision-making imposed by external demands, thought would slow. This slowing would not mean emptiness, but depth. Observations that once passed unnoticed would hold interest longer. At other times, solitude would feel constricting. The absence of shared experience removes validation. Achievements would occur without witnesses. Fixing something, building something, discovering a reliable food source, all meaningful yet unacknowledged by anyone else. The emotional weight of effort without recognition can be heavier than expected. Motivation would need to come from internal standards rather than external praise. Sleep patterns would gradually shift toward natural light cycles. Without artificial illumination extending evening activity, fatigue would arrive earlier. Nights would be longer, dreams possibly more vivid due to reduced overstimulation. Waking before sunrise might become common, not because of alarms, but because environmental cues replace them. The sky itself would become a consistent point of orientation. Over months, patterns in stars would become familiar, rising and setting with dependable timing. Even without formal knowledge of astronomy, repetition would create recognition. The moon's phases would provide a slow, reliable marker of passing time. Diet would remain simple. Variety would be limited by geography and season. Taste preferences might adjust. Foods once considered plain might become satisfying simply because they are available. Hunger sharpens appreciation more effectively than seasoning. The relationship with food would shift from entertainment to sustenance. Injuries, even minor ones, would carry increased significance. A small cut, a twisted ankle, a burn, each would demand attention because there would be no immediate assistance. Caution would increase naturally. Movements would become more deliberate, less impulsive. Years into such isolation, memory of previous routines might soften. The urgency once attached to emails, traffic, deadlines, crowded spaces might feel distant, almost abstract. The body would have adapted to a different baseline of stress, one defined by environmental challenges rather than social complexity. Yet the need for connection would not disappear entirely. Humans do not simply outgrow social instinct. Instead, it might express itself through attachment to place. A specific tree becomes familiar. A section of shoreline feels preferred. Repeated paths across the island begin to resemble streets. The environment becomes mapped not just physically, but emotionally. Hope would fluctuate. Some days might include active signaling, arranging materials to increase visibility, maintaining a fire that could be seen from afar. Other days, effort toward rescue might feel pointless. The cycle between preparation and resignation would not necessarily follow logic. It would respond to mood, weather, energy, and memory. The longer the isolation continues, the more complex the question becomes. Is survival alone the goal, or is eventual return essential? The island, once perceived as a temporary obstacle, might begin to feel like a complete world with understandable rules. The outside world, remembered through fragments, might seem unpredictable by comparison. If rescue eventually appeared, relief would likely mix with hesitation. Noise, conversation, rapid decision-making, crowded sensory input, all could feel overwhelming after prolonged simplicity. Re-entering society would not erase the habits formed during isolation. Slower movement, heightened environmental awareness, preference for quiet, these might persist. Living alone for years on a deserted island would not transform a person into a mythical figure of perfect resilience. It would reveal limits and adaptations in equal measure. The experience would strip life down to essentials: water, shelter, food, rest, awareness. It would also expose how much of identity is shaped through interaction with others. In the end, the most difficult challenge might not be building shelter or finding food. It might be maintaining a continuous sense of self when there is no external reflection confirming who you are. Without names spoken, without roles assigned, identity becomes something you must actively hold rather than something reinforced by daily interaction. And yet there is also a quiet strength in that condition. The knowledge that a human mind can continue functioning, observing, adapting, remembering, hoping, even when removed from nearly all familiar structures, suggests a durability that is easy to overlook in comfortable environments. Survival would not be dramatic most days. It would be repetitive, patient, and quietly determined. On such an island, years would not pass as milestones, but as layers of experience settling one over another. The sound of waves would become less like background noise and more like a constant measure of continuity. Each sunrise would not promise novelty, but it would confirm persistence. Each small success, a repaired roof, a reliable water source, an uninjured day, would carry meaning disproportionate to its simplicity. To live alone that long would require accepting that progress is rarely visible all at once. Change would be gradual, often unnoticed, until memory reaches back and compares the present to a distant past. The island would remain mostly the same, yet your understanding of it would deepen continuously. Familiarity would replace uncertainty, not by eliminating challenge, but by teaching where challenge is likely to appear. There would be a moment, perhaps weeks or months after arrival, when the idea of rescue would stop feeling immediate. Not because hope disappears, but because urgency fades. The mind adjusts its priorities quietly. At first, every distant sound feels like a signal, every change in the horizon like a possibility. Later, the horizon becomes simply a horizon again, wide, consistent, indifferent. Living alone on a deserted island for years would not resemble the dramatic survival stories often imagined. There would be no constant crisis, no continuous battle with nature. Most days would be unremarkable, and that ordinariness would be the real challenge. The difficulty would not lie in rare moments of danger, but in the long stretches where nothing demands your attention urgently. In modern life, boredom is treated as a problem to be solved. On an island, boredom becomes a condition to be inhabited. There is no escape from it, only different ways of experiencing it. Some days, boredom would feel heavy, pressing against thought. Other days, it would dissolve into a calm neutrality where time passes without friction. The body would adapt faster than the mind. Muscles would strengthen through repetition. Skin would toughen under sun and wind. Small injuries would heal more slowly, but would be noticed more carefully. The body would become a reliable system, predictable in its needs. The mind, however, would wander unpredictably, sometimes calm, sometimes restless. Without mirrors, appearance would lose importance. Hair would grow or be cut for practicality. Clothing, if any remained, would be valued for function rather than style. Identity would shift away from how you are perceived and toward what you are capable of doing. Survival tasks would quietly replace social roles. The island would slowly reveal its patterns, where shade lasts longest, which areas flood briefly after rain, which paths are easiest to walk when tired. These observations would not feel like learning facts, but like building familiarity with a living space. The island would no longer feel like an enemy or a test. It would simply be the place where life happens. Memory would change shape over time. Early memories of the outside world would be sharp, emotionally charged. Later, they would soften, becoming less urgent, less detailed. Certain faces might blur, certain voices might lose tone. What would remain clear are emotional impressions rather than specifics, how it felt to be rushed, crowded, distracted. Sound would take on new meaning. Without engines, without crowds, even small noises would stand out. The snap of a branch, the sudden silence of insects, the shift in wave rhythm, all would signal change. You would begin to trust your hearing more than your sight in certain conditions, especially at night. Night itself would become less frightening and more intimate. Darkness would not feel empty. It would feel full of presence that simply does not announce itself. The stars would not just decorate the sky, they would structure it. Their slow movement would be one of the few consistent indicators of time passing beyond daily cycles. At some point, you might stop thinking of yourself as alone and start thinking of yourself as unaccompanied. The difference is subtle but important. Alone implies absence. Unaccompanied implies independence. The shift would not be permanent, but it would appear from time to time, offering relief from the emotional weight of solitude. Food would remain a daily concern, but not a dramatic one. You would learn which efforts are worth repeating and which are not. Efficiency would matter more than ambition. A reliable, modest food source would be preferable to a risky attempt at abundance. Hunger teaches moderation more effectively than instruction ever could. The absence of conversation would change how thoughts unfold. Without interruption, ideas would extend further before resolving. Some thoughts would loop unnecessarily. Others would deepen into insights that would never have surfaced amid constant stimulation. The mind, given space, reveals both its strengths and its habits. You might invent small rituals without realizing it, sitting in the same place at sunrise, checking certain locations in the same order, preparing food in a specific sequence. These rituals would provide structure, not because structure is required, but because predictability offers comfort when nothing else does. There would be moments of unexpected emotion, a sudden sadness with no clear source, A brief happiness triggered by something trivial, a familiar bird, a successful repair, a calm evening. Without social context to explain or label these feelings, you would experience them more directly without analysis. Over years, patience would become less of a virtue and more of a default state. Waiting would no longer feel like delay. It would feel like part of the process. The idea of wasting time would lose meaning when time itself is no longer segmented by obligation. The question of whether you could live this way would slowly transform into a different question. What parts of you are shaped by constant interaction and what parts exist independently of it? Isolation does not erase personality, but it does expose which elements depend on social reinforcement. There would be no audience for fear, no one to reassure you during moments of doubt. Fear would still exist, but it would be quieter, more internal. You would learn to sit with it rather than react to it immediately. Over time, fear might become less dramatic, more informative. The idea of rescue would never disappear entirely. It would retreat and return in cycles. Some days you might prepare signals meticulously. Other days the thought would feel distant, almost irrelevant. Neither state would last forever. Emotional equilibrium would remain fluid. The island would not offer meaning. Meaning would have to be constructed from repetition, effort, and attention. Survival itself would not feel heroic, it would feel necessary. And within that necessity, small choices would gain disproportionate importance. If years passed this way, returning to society would not simply reverse the experience. The island would leave traces in how silence is tolerated, in how attention is distributed, in how little is needed to feel occupied. The world beyond the island might feel louder, faster, less patient. But that future moment would remain hypothetical for a long time. Most of life on the island would be lived without reference to an endpoint. Each day would exist largely on its own terms, connected loosely to the ones before and after. There is a kind of quiet that does not begin with silence, but with the removal of expectation. On a deserted island, that quiet settles slowly, almost politely, as if the world is stepping back to see what you will do without assistance. No schedules wait for you. No one expects an answer. The day does not begin because an alarm demands it, but because the light eventually reaches your closed eyes and warmth pushes sleep away. Living alone on an uninhabited island for years would not feel like a continuous struggle against danger. Most of the time, nothing dramatic would happen at all. The greater challenge would be learning how to exist when urgency disappears. In modern environments, attention is constantly pulled outward by noise, obligation, and interruption. On an island, attention has nowhere obvious to go, so it turns inward or settles onto whatever is directly in front of you. At first, survival would be defined by immediate physical needs. Water would become more valuable than comfort, more important than any long-term plan. The search for drinkable water would shift how you look at the environment. A depression in the ground is no longer just a shape, it might be a temporary reservoir. A cluster of broad leaves is not decoration, it could collect rain. Every part of the landscape becomes a question waiting to be answered through trial. Food would follow as a constant but quieter concern. Hunger does not shout at first, it nudges, then insists. The concept of a meal would simplify dramatically. Variety would matter less than reliability. If something can be obtained consistently, even in small amounts, it becomes precious. Waiting would become a skill rather than an inconvenience. Waiting near water, waiting for something to fall, waiting for the right moment to try again after failure. Shelter would begin as an imperfect arrangement of whatever materials can be moved without tools, something that blocks the sun more effectively than it blocks the wind. Even so, creating any form of structure would introduce a subtle psychological shift. The environment would no longer be entirely indifferent. A small portion of it would reflect your decisions. That alone would provide a sense of stability. The body would adjust quickly to repetition, walking uneven ground, carrying materials, lifting, bending, all repeated daily would produce strength that has nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with efficiency. Energy would become something you feel directly. Effort would have visible cost, so movements would grow more deliberate. Sound would change meaning. Without engines or distant human activity, the remaining noises would become layered and precise. The rhythm of waves against different surfaces would signal depth or shallowness. Insects would create a constant, shifting background. The sudden absence of sound might be more noticeable than sound itself, prompting attention without panic. Darkness would no longer be an on-off condition controlled by switches. It would arrive gradually, thickening the air until shapes lose definition. At first, this would produce tension. The mind is accustomed to seeing clearly at all times. Over weeks, familiarity would replace unease. Hearing would take on greater responsibility. The night would feel inhabited, not empty. Loneliness would not appear dramatically. It would surface in moments when no task requires focus. After water is gathered, after food is secured, after repairs are complete, there would be stretches of time without instruction. Thought would fill that space. Memories would replay without interruption, sometimes with surprising clarity. Speaking aloud would likely begin without conscious decision. A comment made while adjusting something, a brief reaction to success or frustration. Language helps stabilize thought, even when there is no listener. Over time, talking might become part of routine, not as a sign of distress, but as a way to maintain continuity between one moment and the next. Days would stretch differently without clocks. Morning would begin when light changes temperature against the skin. Evening would not arrive suddenly, but in layers of dimming color. Counting days might continue at first, marked by scratches or arranged objects. Eventually, the need to count might fade as memory organizes itself around events rather than numbers. Storms would become deeply personal experiences, not because they target you, but because their effects are immediate and unavoidable. The sound alone would dominate awareness. Afterward, the landscape would shift slightly. Something would be moved, broken, or revealed. Repairing damage would reinforce patience and acceptance that stability is always temporary. Over time, the island would stop feeling unfamiliar. Paths would develop naturally, repeated movements shaping the easiest routes between locations. Certain areas would become associated with success or difficulty. The environment would be mapped not only physically but emotionally. The absence of social interaction would gradually reshape identity. Without being addressed by name, without fulfilling roles defined by others, the sense of self would rely more heavily on memory and internal narrative. You would still recognize who you are, but that recognition would be maintained actively rather than reinforced externally. There would be moments of unexpected calm, sitting without purpose, watching the movement of water, feeling wind change direction. You might experience stretches of attention that are uninterrupted by thought. These moments would not feel empty, they would feel complete in themselves. There would also be moments of sharp longing, a remembered voice, a fragment of a familiar place. These memories would not arrive on schedule. They would appear suddenly, then fade again, leaving a subtle emotional residue that lingers longer than expected. Food, once a source of pleasure and variety, would become closely tied to effort. A small success in gathering or catching something would carry disproportionate satisfaction, not because the taste is exceptional, but because the connection between action and result is immediate and undeniable. Sleep patterns would shift toward natural cycles. Without artificial light extending activity, fatigue would arrive earlier. Nights would be longer. Dreams might become more vivid, shaped by repetitive surroundings and reduced sensory overload. The sky would become a consistent reference point. Over months, star patterns would become familiar through repetition alone. The moon's slow cycle would provide a broader sense of passing time. Looking upward would not be entertainment, but orientation. As months turn into years, the urgency attached to previous routines might fade. Deadlines, crowded schedules, constant communication, these concepts might begin to feel distant, almost theoretical. The body's baseline stress would be defined more by environmental uncertainty than by social demand. Yet the need for connection would not disappear entirely. Instead, attachment might shift toward place. A particular tree becomes familiar. A section of shoreline feels preferred. Repeated actions create a sense of companionship with environment rather than people. Hope would fluctuate naturally. Some days might involve active attempts to be visible, maintaining signals, arranging materials in clear patterns. Other days, effort toward rescue might feel unnecessary. Neither state would be permanent. Emotional balance would move in cycles rather than remain fixed. If rescue eventually appeared, the reaction would likely be complex. Relief would mix with hesitation. After years of slow, predictable stimuli, sudden noise and rapid conversation could feel overwhelming. The habits formed in isolation would not disappear immediately. Living alone on a deserted island for years would not create a legend. It would create a person who has learned to exist with fewer assumptions. The experience would reveal how much of daily life is constructed from expectation rather than necessity. The most difficult challenge might not be obtaining food or building shelter. It might be maintaining a continuous sense of identity without external confirmation. Without hearing your name, without shared experiences, you would need to hold your own narrative internally. And yet, there is quiet evidence that the human mind can endure extended simplicity. Survival would not be dramatic most days. It would be repetitive, patient, and steady. Each sunrise would confirm continuation rather than promise change. Over long stretches of time, the island would remain mostly the same, but your understanding of it would deepen continuously. Familiarity would not remove challenge, but it would reduce uncertainty. The unknown would shrink, replaced by patterns learned through observation. Silence, once interpreted as absence, might eventually be recognized as a space filled with subtle activity. Water reshaping sand grain by grain, wind adjusting leaves in barely visible increments. Life continuing without acknowledgement. To live this way would require accepting that progress is rarely visible all at once. Change would accumulate slowly. The measure of success would shift from achievement to continuity. A deserted island does not introduce itself with drama. It does not announce its rules or explain what will be required to remain there for years. It simply exists, surrounded by water that moves with steady patience, as if time itself has decided to slow down in that place. The first realization would not be fear, but a quiet awareness that nothing is arranged for your comfort. The ground is not shaped to fit your steps. The shade is not placed where you would prefer it. Every convenience that once felt ordinary would suddenly reveal how deliberate human environments actually are. In the earliest days, the body would dictate priorities with surprising authority. Thirst would not feel like a mild inconvenience, but a clear command that overrides thought. You would begin scanning the landscape not as scenery, but as a collection of possibilities. A shallow depression might hold rainwater. A cluster of leaves might guide runoff toward a small pool. Even the pattern of damp soil would become meaningful information. This kind of attention is different from curiosity. It is focused, practical, and immediate. Food would become less about preference and more about consistency. A reliable but simple source of nourishment would matter far more than variety. Waiting would become an essential activity rather than wasted time, waiting for the tide to shift, waiting for something edible to appear within reach, waiting after failure knowing that trying again too quickly only consumes energy without improving results. Patience would not be philosophical, it would be efficient. The first shelter would likely be temporary in both design and expectation. Materials gathered by hand rarely produce perfection. Yet even a fragile structure would create a boundary between exposure and protection. That boundary, however imperfect, would offer psychological stability. It would mark a space that exists because of your effort, not because it was provided in advance. As the days continued, physical exertion would become routine rather than exhausting. Repeated movement across uneven terrain would strengthen muscles in ways that feel practical. The body would begin to conserve energy automatically, adjusting posture, pacing, and effort without conscious planning. Efficiency would replace speed as the preferred approach to nearly every task. Sound would transform from background noise into a primary source of information. Without engines or distant voices, each layer of natural sound would become distinct. The rhythm of waves against different surfaces would signal depth or obstruction. Insects would create a shifting pattern that changes subtly with temperature and light. Even the direction of wind could be detected not only by touch, but by how leaves respond. Night would introduce a different kind of awareness. Darkness without artificial light is not merely dim, it is immersive. Edges soften, distances become uncertain. At first, the mind might respond with tension, interpreting the unknown as potential threat. Over time, familiarity would reduce that tension. The same sounds would repeat night after night, gradually forming a recognizable pattern. Loneliness would not appear suddenly. It would arrive during moments when no task requires attention. After water is secured, after food is gathered, after repairs are completed, there would be stretches of unstructured time. In those stretches, memory would become more active. Past conversations might replay with unusual clarity. Small details once overlooked could feel unexpectedly vivid. Speaking aloud would likely begin as a practical habit, a brief remark made while working, a verbal acknowledgement of success or frustration. Language provides structure to thought, even when no listener exists. Over time, spoken words might become part of daily rhythm, marking transitions between tasks. Time itself would lose its precise edges. Without clocks, morning would begin with light rather than numbers. Evening would arrive gradually, marked by temperature shifts and fading color. Counting days might continue for a while, perhaps marked physically. Eventually, the purpose of counting might feel less important than the continuity of experience. Weather would carry emotional weight. A period of rain could provide relief if water storage is low, or anxiety if shelter proves inadequate. Wind direction might influence where effort is focused. Environmental conditions would no longer be distant topics, but immediate influences on mood and decision-making. Over months, familiarity with the island would grow through repetition. Certain paths would become easier simply because they are used often. Particular locations would develop associations based on previous success or difficulty. The landscape would feel less like an unknown territory and more like a lived space. Identity would begin to shift subtly without social reinforcement. Without hearing your name spoken, without fulfilling roles defined by others, the sense of self would rely more heavily on internal narrative. You would still remember who you were, but that memory would require occasional intentional reflection. There would be moments of quiet satisfaction, completing a small repair, discovering a dependable source of food, experiencing an uneventful day without injury. These achievements would not be dramatic, yet they would carry genuine meaning because their results are immediate. There would also be moments of unexpected longing, a remembered voice, a familiar environment from another life. These memories would surface without warning and fade gradually, leaving a lingering emotional trace. Sleep patterns would gradually align with natural light cycles. Without artificial illumination extending activity, fatigue would arrive earlier. Nights would feel longer. Dreams might become more vivid due to reduced sensory overload during waking hours. The sky would become a reliable reference point. Over time, repeated observation would make certain star patterns familiar. The moon's phases would provide a slow, consistent marker of passing time. Looking upward would become both habit and orientation. As years passed, urgency connected to previous routines might diminish. The memory of constant communication, crowded environments, and tight schedules could begin to feel distant. The baseline level of stress would be shaped more by environmental unpredictability than by social pressure. Yet the instinct for connection would remain. It might shift toward attachment to place. A particular section of shoreline could feel preferred. A tree that provides consistent shade might become familiar in a way that resembles companionship. Hope for eventual rescue would not disappear entirely. It would rise and fall in cycles. Some days would include deliberate effort to remain visible. Other days would focus solely on immediate survival. Emotional states would shift gradually rather than dramatically. If rescue eventually occurred, the transition back into a populated environment would likely feel overwhelming at first. Noise, rapid conversation, and constant movement could contrast sharply with years of measured, deliberate living. Living alone on a deserted island for years would not transform someone into a mythical survivor. It would instead reveal how adaptable the human mind and body can be when stripped of excess. Survival would be built on repetition, attention, and patience rather than heroism. The most demanding aspect might not be physical hardship, but maintaining a continuous sense of identity without external confirmation. Without shared experiences, the narrative of who you are would need to be held internally. And yet, there would also be a quiet resilience in that condition. The recognition that existence can continue with very little structure would challenge assumptions about what is truly necessary. Each sunrise would not promise change, but it would confirm continuation. Each uneventful day would carry value simply because it extends the chain of survival. Over long stretches of time, the island itself would appear largely unchanged, yet your perception of it would deepen. Familiarity would replace uncertainty, not by removing challenge, but by revealing patterns. Silence would eventually be understood not as emptiness, but as a field of subtle movement, water reshaping the shoreline, wind shifting leaves, life continuing without acknowledgement. To remain there for years would require accepting that progress is rarely dramatic. Change would accumulate quietly, often unnoticed until memory reaches back and compares. The sea does not care how long you plan to stay. It does not measure your determination or weigh your memories. It moves in its own slow cycles, repeating gestures it has practiced for centuries. And when you find yourself alone on a deserted island, that indifference becomes impossible to ignore. The first lesson is not survival, but humility. You are no longer at the center of anything. You are simply present. In the beginning, your thoughts would still belong to another life. You would wake up expecting structure, expecting purpose to arrive from somewhere outside yourself. Even if you knew intellectually that no one was coming, the mind would continue to wait. Old habits die slowly. You might still feel the urge to hurry, to finish tasks quickly, to move on to the next thing. But the island would not respond to haste. It would offer no reward for speed. Water would define your days more than any other need. You would learn the island's moods through moisture, the way rain falls differently depending on wind, the way soil darkens when it holds water beneath the surface, the way plants reveal their secrets only to those who look closely and repeatedly. You would make mistakes. You would drink water you should not have trusted. Your body would teach you lessons your thoughts never could. Food would teach patience in a quieter way. Hunger sharpens attention, but it also teaches restraint. Not every opportunity is worth pursuing. Not every effort produces reward. You would learn to read signs, disturbed sand, broken shells, patterns in the water. Over time, you would stop thinking in terms of meals and start thinking in terms of balance. Enough is enough. Excess is waste. Shelter would evolve slowly, shaped less by design and more by revision. Each night would reveal a flaw. Each storm would expose a weakness. You would learn to accept imperfection, because perfection requires tools and time you do not have. A roof that leaks slightly but stands is better than one that collapses while you try to improve it. Practical thinking replaces ideal thinking. Your body would change without ceremony. Muscles would harden where they are used often. Skin would grow less sensitive to heat and wind. Small pains would become familiar companions, no longer alarming but informative. You would move differently, not because you are trying to, but because inefficiency costs too much. Time would begin to loosen its grip. Without clocks, hours lose their sharp boundaries. Morning is no longer a number, but a feeling. Cool air, low light, the sound of the sea changing tone. Evening arrives in layers. Night settles slowly. At first, this freedom might feel unsettling. Later, it would feel natural. Silence would behave strangely. It would not be constant. It would pulse. Some moments would feel heavy with it, others light. Without human voices, the mind fills gaps creatively. You might hear echoes that are not there. You might replay conversations until they lose their original voices and become something abstract. Memory becomes less accurate and more emotional. You would begin to speak aloud, almost without noticing when it starts. A sentence here, a reaction there. Language becomes a way to keep shape in your thoughts. It prevents them from dissolving into endless loops. You are not talking to someone, you are talking to the moment. Loneliness would not be steady, it would come and go. Some days, solitude would feel like relief, no judgment, no interruption, no need to perform. Other days, the absence of response would feel sharp. You would miss being seen, even if you never enjoyed attention before. Humans do not need crowds, but they need acknowledgement. The island would slowly become familiar in a way cities rarely do. You would know where the ground is soft, where it cuts your feet, where it stays warm at night. You would recognize individual trees, not by name, but by function, shade, shelter, signal. The environment becomes a set of relationships rather than a backdrop. Weather would influence your mood directly. A calm day would bring calm thoughts. A long stretch of wind might make you restless without knowing why. You would stop separating emotion from environment. They are not separate things anymore. Dreams would change. Without constant stimulation, the mind digs deeper. Dreams might become longer, more vivid, sometimes unsettling. You might dream of people you barely remember, or places that no longer exist. Waking up would feel like crossing between two equally real worlds. Fear would still exist, but it would mature. It would stop shouting. It would start advising. You would know when not to push, when to rest, when to wait. Recklessness would fade, replaced by quiet calculation. Survival is not bravery, it is consistency. As months turn into years, memory of your old life would thin, not disappear, but soften. You would remember feelings more than details, the stress of crowds, the pressure of time, the constant sense of being late for something undefined. These memories would feel distant, almost fictional. Hope would become complicated. You would still want rescue, but you might stop rehearsing it constantly. The idea of leaving would sit in the background rather than dominating thought. Life would happen here, regardless of future outcomes. The island would not pause while you imagine elsewhere. Rituals would appear, not planned but discovered. The same place to sit in the morning, the same path walked before sleep. These patterns would provide stability when nothing else does. They would remind you that days connect to one another. You would begin to notice how little is actually required to keep going. Water, food, shelter, awareness. Everything else, once considered essential, would feel optional. This realization would not make life easier, but it would make it clearer. There would be moments of deep calm where you feel entirely present. No past, no future, just movement, breath, sound. These moments would not last, but they would leave an impression. They would suggest that peace is not something to achieve, but something to stop interrupting. If rescue ever came, it would feel unreal. Noise would be overwhelming. Language would feel fast. Choices would feel excessive. You would carry the island with you, not as nostalgia, but as a different way of measuring what matters. Living alone on a deserted island for years would not turn you into someone else. It would strip you closer to who you already were, beneath distraction and expectation. It would teach you that endurance is not dramatic, and meaning does not announce itself.